Happy Wednesday. Today is Wednesday, September 30th, 2020, and it's really nice weather outside today. It actually feels like fall, fitting for the last day of September. I'm kind of excited about it, in case you can't tell, because, it's a nice day in Chattanooga. You should get out and enjoy it after you watch this. And today's daily Bible readings are from Psalm 42, Exodus 19, 9 through 25, Matthew 9, 2 through 8, or you could have read Psalm 28, Judges 16, 23 through 31, and then Matthew 9, 2 through 8. And just another word of explanation on the daily Bible readings and the revised lectionary. I think some people wonder why after we got to a certain point, all of a sudden there were two sets of readings for each day, and that's just kind of the way that the lectionary is set up. The daily Bible readings, like I've said, one half of the week kind of follows up the previous Sunday, and then the next half of the week is getting ready for the coming Sunday. And after Pentecost, after the season of Pentecost proper is finished, which only is about a month, then we get into what's called regular time or ordinary time, right? And the propers, and it's basically just that every part of the year that's not Advent through Pentecost, because there aren't really any really huge holidays going on like that. I mean, there are some like holy days, things like that, but it's just this kind of long stretch that stretches out from June all the way into November. And so we get these readings, and one is just a complementary reading to what's going on with the lectionary. And as I'm saying that, it's interesting because we're almost done with the Christian year. The Christian year ends with Christ the King Sunday, or so you also see it Christ the Redeemer, in November, and then it begins with Advent. And Advent is kind of early this year. It's actually the Sunday right after Thanksgiving. And I know you're thinking, well, now that's a long way out. It'll be here before you know it. And so it's interesting. We are finishing up the lectionary year for year A, and then it'll be year B. Anyway, so I want to talk about Matthew today, which is once again 9 through 2:8, and it's this story that everybody's learned about the paralytic. You learned it in Sunday school. If you ever went to Vacation Bible School, it was probably a story that you heard. And it's interesting because the story is just about, well, the guy is named, he's not given a name. His name is paralytic in this story. That's the only way he's identified at the beginning, is that he's identified as paralytic by his deficit, right? His shortcoming is him being a paralytic, and that's the burden he bears. And so, but this is a story really about the problem when the problem isn't really the problem. So the world, this guy's friends, and himself included, probably identified the man as a paralytic. In their eyes, that's who he was. That's what he was. That's what identified him. And if we can get Jesus to heal him, they're thinking, then he'll be a person, right? Then his problems will be solved. He'll be a whole person, and things will be different. And and kudos on them. They had a great deal of faith in Jesus, and they went to extraordinary effort to take care of their friend. And that's a story in itself, and that's a subject for another time. But there's kind of this issue that he's identified by his deficit, and that's really a thing that we should actually be concerned about, because there are a lot of people in this world that the society wants to just identify by their deficits, and the society even teaches them to do that themselves. And the interesting thing is, in Jesus's mind here, that problem was not really the problem that this guy had. It wasn't the big challenge for Jesus. So, like I said, the world identified this guy as a paralytic. He probably identified himself that way. And Jesus comes along and doesn't identify him that way. Jesus isn't seeming like he's really very concerned with his paralysis. So, Jesus identifies him differently. His paralysis wasn't Jesus' main concern, like I said, and he was concerned, however, about his orientation towards God. So here you got this guy who's laying on a mat. His orientation to everybody is horizontal, and his friends are trying to get him vertical, and Jesus is worried about his orientation towards God. So the problem in that case then is sin. All right, the burden of sin was the main concern for Jesus, not this burden of paralysis that the guy dealt with, but the burden for Jesus's concern was the sin that isolated him from God, that kept him from being oriented towards God, right? So the problem is sin. What is the solution? The solution is forgiveness. And when Jesus pronounces these words of forgiveness upon this guy, calls him son, and says, "You are forgiven," it kind of registers shock and awe. I'm sure shock and awe in the crowd in general. We're not told much about that, but definitely shock and awe among the scribes. They were in shock that he would say this, that he would use these words, and they were just in awe, I think, in their hearts about his arrogance as they perceived it in doing this. So when you expect a miraculous healing, right, but you get a scandalous forgiveness instead, and that's really what's going on here. Jesus's act of forgiving was scandalous in the eyes of these people. No one was looking for that. The scribes were resentful of it. They were resentful that he would take this kind of authority. St. Jerome talks about what the paralytic had obtained. He takes poetic license and kind of creates this internal dialogue, because we're told that the scribes are saying this to themselves. And then further on this text, we realize that they're not even saying it out loud to each other. The way Jesus is talking about it, they're all thinking it at the same time, and it's in their hearts. And it says that Jesus perceives the thoughts of the scribes, right, who accuse him of blasphemy by forgiving sins. And Jerome, like I said, he continues the dialogue with the little poetic license, and this is quoting him. He says, "By the same power and prerogative by which I see your thoughts," this is Jesus speaking in Jerome's little poetic here. He says, "I can forgive men their sins." Then he says to them, "Learn from your own experience what the paralytic has obtained." And so he's saying, you're caught up in this anger at me, and you're accusing me of heresy, but you need to be like the paralytic, and you need to experience for yourself what this guy has just obtained. So what had the paralytic obtained? Well, he obtained what the scribes desperately needed too, and what he obtained was forgiveness of his sins, relief of that burden. And we call that grace justification. John Wesley tells us that it is that justification, that grace that we call justification, is God relieving us of the burden of guilt, the burden of the guilt of sin that we owe. And he has a sermon called Justification by Faith, and I've got this kind of longish quote from it. But he puts it this way, and I think it's quite appropriate for the story of the paralytic. And this is John Wesley speaking, so forgive the 18th century English. But he says, "These who are sick, the burden of whose sins is intolerable, are they that need a physician. These who are guilty, who've grown under the wrath of God, are they that need a pardon. These who are condemned already, not only by God, but also by their own conscience, and by 1,000 witnesses of all their ungodliness, both in thought and word and work, cry aloud for him that justifieth the ungodly through the redemption that is in Jesus." So, this guy, Wesley, is hitting on it here that, when a lot of times we identify ourselves by a huge number of problems. And the world identifies us by that too. And like I said, this guy, we're not given a name for him. He's named paralytic. That's all anybody cares about. And in the scribe's way of thinking, he was probably a paralytic also because he had done, or his parents had done, some kind of great sin. This question comes up to Jesus from his own disciples, right? The man born blind, they ask him, who sinned, this guy or his parents? And so Jesus knows that this guy, he needs a physician. Yeah, he needs a pardon. He needs to be re-identified. He needs his identity shifted. So yes, paralysis was a problem for this guy, but not such a burden as his identity. And at the beginning of the day, like I said, his identity was tied up in his deficit. A paralytic, he was helpless to do or to be anything else in his own eyes, in everyone else's eyes. And we're not much different. We define ourselves by our deficits, and we allow them to make us helpless to do or to be anything else. There's a guy named Kenneth Gergen, and he wrote this book called The Saturated Self. I think it came out way back in the 90s, which sounds odd to say way back in the 90s. But he talks about how over the past century, there has been this whole language of deficit developed that people identify themselves by and are encouraged to identify themselves by and are categorized by. And he says this, he says, to put it more broadly, the vocabulary of human deficit has undergone enormous expansion within the present century. He says, we have countless ways of locating faults within ourselves and others that were unavailable to even our great-grandfathers. And so it's like we didn't have enough to burden ourselves with before, but we've created a whole new language so we can burden ourselves even more and define ourselves in ways that kind of make us helpless to do or to be anything better. We need a new identity. And what Jesus offered the paralytic and what scandalized the scribes was a new identity. And it wasn't one, the identity he offered the paralytic wasn't one assigned by himself or by his friends and neighbors or by the society at large that was just based on his shortcomings, like paralytic or sinner. It was one given by Jesus himself and his Father, and that was forgiven. He called him forgiven. He called him son. So, we all live in this world where we kind of burden ourselves with these identifiers that call out our deficits, and other people are all too willing to call out our deficits and identify us by them. But what Christ offers you is forgiveness and offers you a new name based on that. So that's the DBR for today. Have a good afternoon. Get out and enjoy the weather, unless it's like raining and miserable where you are. Just get out and enjoy it. And we'll see you later. Boop.